I should never have gone. That thought sat in my chest the entire Uber ride over, quiet and insistent, like a warning I kept choosing to ignore. But when Carter Voss personally adds your name to an exclusive penthouse guest list, something stupid happens to your brain. Rational thought evaporates. Hope, that dangerous, embarrassing thing, takes over completely. And so there I was, Eli Brooks, 21 years old, fine arts scholarship student and part-time assistant at the smallest gallery in the city, standing in the elevator of a building where the lobby alone cost more than my entire apartment building. I'd had a crush on Carter Voss for 8 months. I'm not proud of it. Carter was the kind of person who filled every room he entered. Not because he was particularly warm or kind, but because he had money and confidence in quantities that made people forget to question whether he was actually worth their attention. He was studying business because his father owned half the commercial real estate in the city, and someone had to inherit it eventually. He threw parties that people talked about for weeks. He smiled at you and somehow made you feel both chosen and disposable at the exact same time. And I stupidly, completely had convinced myself that underneath all of that, there was something genuine worth reaching for. The penthouse was on the 42nd floor, and when those elevator doors opened, the noise and light hit me like a physical force. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured gold light across a crowd of people who all seemed to know each other, all seemed to belong together, all seemed to speak the same unspoken language of wealth and ease that I had never learned. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city spread below like a circuit board, all glowing lines and dark spaces. Someone pressed a glass of something sparkling into my hand almost immediately, and I took it gratefully because at least it gave my hands something to do. I spotted Carter near the center of the main room, surrounded by his usual rotation of friends who laughed at exactly the right moments, and never seemed to disagree with anything he said. He was wearing a pale blue shirt, open at the collar, effortlessly put together, talking with his hands the way he always did when he was performing for an audience. I took a breath, straightened the collar of my jacket, thrift store, clean, the best I had, and started making my way toward him through the crowd. I got within 10 feet before it happened. Someone moved behind me, abrupt and careless, and their shoulder caught mine with enough force that I stumbled sideways. My feet crossed. The sparkling drink in my hand lurched. I reached for something to catch myself and found nothing, and then I was falling, properly falling, not gracefully stumbling, and I crashed directly into the long decorative table behind me. Glass shattered. The table collapsed under my weight with a sound that cut through the music like a gunshot. Everything stopped. The music didn't actually stop, but the people around me did. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. I was on the floor in a scatter of broken glass and spilled drinks, my jacket twisted, my palms stinging where they'd caught the floor, my face burning with a heat so intense I could feel it in my ears. For a single suspended moment, the entire room stared at me in silence. Then Carter laughed. It wasn't a surprised laugh or an uncomfortable laugh. It was genuine, delighted amusement, the kind that says, "This is exactly the entertainment I needed." He turned to the person beside him and said loudly enough that I could hear it clearly from the floor, "Did someone actually invite him, or did he just follow someone in?" And his friends laughed with him because that's what they did, because Carter set the temperature of every room and they all adjusted accordingly. I tried to push myself up. My hands shook. The glass on the floor shifted under my palms and I flinched back, and that small flinch, that involuntary moment of vulnerability, drew another ripple of laughter from somewhere in the crowd. I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes, and I hated myself for it because the last thing I needed was to cry in front of these people, in front of him. Then a shadow fell over me. I looked up and found a man crouching beside me. Not frantically, not dramatically, but with the measured calm of someone who had assessed the situation and decided exactly what needed to happen. Rhys Lawson. I'd seen him before at Carter's events. Always at the edges, always watchful, never speaking unless spoken to. Carter's personal bodyguard. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cut close on the sides and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He was wearing all-black jacket, shirt, everything, and his expression was completely unreadable except for something tight and controlled around his eyes that I would later learn was anger. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't make a production of it. He simply slid one arm beneath my knees and the other behind my back, and in one smooth, unhesitating motion, lifted me completely off the floor. I made a sound, something embarrassingly close to a squeak, and grabbed his shoulders instinctively. He was solid under my hands in a way that felt almost architectural, like holding onto a wall. "I've got you," he said quietly, so quietly that only I could hear it, and his voice was low and even and somehow the calmest thing I'd encountered all evening. The crowd parted for him automatically. Nobody questioned Rhys Lawson when he moved with purpose. Something about his presence simply made people step aside. I heard Carter say something behind us, his voice sharpening from amusement to something more uncertain. But Rhys didn't acknowledge it. He didn't look back. He walked us through the crowd, into the hallway, and straight to the elevator, and his grip on me never wavered for a single second. The elevator doors closed behind us, and the noise of the party became muffled, then disappeared entirely. I became acutely aware of how close we were, how I was essentially being held by a man I'd never spoken to. My arms still around his shoulders, his arms still completely stable beneath me. "You can put me down," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. In a moment, Rhys said. He wasn't being dismissive, he was being practical. The elevator was moving, the floor wasn't stable, and apparently Rhys Lawson operated on the principle of finishing what he started. When the doors opened in the lobby, he carried me to one of the low benches near the entrance and set me down with a care that felt completely disproportionate to our relationship, which was technically non-existent. Then he straightened, reached into his jacket and produced a small first aid kit with the ease of someone who was always prepared for exactly this kind of situation. "Your hands," he said simply. I looked down. My palms had caught the floor when I'd fallen, and there were small scrapes across both of them, not serious but stinging. I extended them toward him without really thinking about it, operating on some automatic level below conscious decision-making, and Rhys sat beside me on the bench and began cleaning the scrapes with quiet, methodical efficiency. His hands were careful, deliberately careful, the kind of careful that required conscious effort from someone with his size and his obvious physical capability. He worked without hurrying, without making me feel like this was an inconvenience, and the gentleness of it was so unexpected and so complete that my throat tightened for an entirely different reason than embarrassment. "Why did you do that?" I asked finally. "Go up there, I mean, to Carter's parties." I wasn't asking about tonight specifically. I was asking about all of it. All the times I'd hovered at the edges of Carter's world hoping to matter. Rhys didn't answer immediately. He finished with my right hand and moved to my left, his focus precise and unhurried. "Some people," he said carefully, "have a way of making you believe they're worth the effort, until you see them clearly." He secured a small bandage and then, for the first time, looked directly at me. His eyes were darker than I'd expected up close, a deep layered brown that held something quietly intense beneath the surface. "You saw him clearly tonight." "I saw him laugh," I said, and my voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Yes," Rhys said. He didn't soften it or offer a different interpretation. He just acknowledged it, simply and completely, and somehow that honesty was more comforting than any reassurance would have been. "You deserved better than that. You deserved better than any of that." I didn't know what to say to him. I didn't know what to do with the fact that a stranger, a man who owed me nothing, who didn't know my name, who had just watched me humiliate myself in front of 40 people, was sitting beside me in a quiet lobby, treating my scraped hands like they were something worth caring for. So I said nothing, and Rhys said nothing, and the city moved outside the glass doors, indifferent and glittering, while something quiet and unnameable settled between us in the silence. 3 days passed before I saw him again. 3 days during which I replayed the elevator ride approximately 400 times, heard Carter's laughter in quiet moments when I was trying to concentrate on other things, and told myself firmly and repeatedly that whatever I'd felt sitting beside Rhys Lawson in that lobby was simply gratitude, nothing more. Gratitude was appropriate. Gratitude was safe. Gratitude didn't complicate anything. On the 4th morning, I was opening the gallery where I worked part-time, unlocking the front door in the pale early light, carrying 2 cups of coffee because my coworker always arrived late and I always arrived early, when I found a folded piece of paper tucked under the door handle. Thick paper, the kind you'd use for letters rather than notes. My name was written on the outside in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with intention. I set down the coffees, unfolded it, and read. "I should have asked your name before I left. I'm told it's Eli. Mine is Rhys. If you're willing, I'd like to know you're actually okay. Not the kind of okay people say to end conversations. The real kind. Einer L." There was a phone number at the bottom. I stood on the gallery steps in the morning chill and read the note 3 times. Then I took a photo of it, texted the number the photo with no other message, and went inside to start my shift. My phone buzzed 11 minutes later. That's either the most creative response to a note or you're still in shock from the party. Either way, good morning, Eli. I laughed out loud in an empty gallery at 7:45 in the morning, and it was the first time I'd laughed in 4 days. We texted carefully at first, the way you do when you're not entirely sure what you're building, but you're certain you don't want to break it prematurely. He asked about the gallery. I asked about his work. He told me he'd been doing personal security for 3 years, that he'd studied criminology before circumstances redirected him, that he preferred early mornings and black coffee and didn't understand why people voluntarily watched horror films. I told him about the fine arts program, about the specific kind of exhaustion that came from loving something enough to study it seriously, about how I'd wanted to work with art since I was 9 years old and saw a painting in a museum that made me feel like the floor had dropped away beneath me. He responded, "What painting?" And when I told him a hopper, the specific one, the light through the window and the woman who might be waiting or might simply be existing, he was quiet for a moment, and then I understand that, seeing something that makes the floor drop. I know what that feels like. We met for coffee on a Thursday afternoon, a week after the party, a small place near campus that I'd suggested because it was familiar ground, because I needed something familiar given that nothing about this situation was. Rhys arrived exactly on time, wearing dark jeans and a gray pullover that made him look less like a bodyguard and more like someone's older brother. Approachable, quiet, solid. He bought the coffee without asking how I took it, because apparently he'd noted it from my texts and he got it exactly right. We sat for 2 hours and I don't think either of us noticed the time passing. He listened the way almost nobody listened, completely, without preparing his next sentence while you were still finishing yours. When he spoke, it was considered and honest in a way that occasionally caught me off guard because I wasn't used to people who said exactly what they meant without softening it into something easier. "Carter knows I met you here," Rhys said near the end. He said it without drama, just placing the information on the table between us. He saw us on a security camera leaving the building together. He asked me about it. "What did you say?" I asked carefully. "That I was doing my job," Rhys said. "That you needed assistance leaving and I provided it." He paused. Which was true. It was just not the complete truth. He looked at me steadily. "I'm telling you because you should know. Carter pays attention to things that he considers to belong to him. He doesn't consider you a person he cares about, but he may consider you something he'd prefer to keep in a particular position." "You mean he'll be upset if he thinks you actually—" "Yes," Rhys said simply. "If he thinks this is something, is it something?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and I immediately wanted to collect them back because the question was enormous and we'd had one coffee and this was reckless. Rhys looked at me for a long moment, not uncomfortable silence, the other kind, the kind where someone is being genuinely careful because the answer matters. "I think it could be," he said finally. "If you want it to be. I'm not going to pretend I sought you out because it was my professional obligation." My heart did something complicated, and I looked at my coffee cup. "Rhys, you work for Carter. If he found out—" "I'm aware of the situation," Rhys said, and his voice was calm, but underneath the calm was something with more weight. "I've been aware of it since I left that note. I made a choice with the information in front of me. I'd like you to be able to make yours with the same." That night, lying on my bed staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, I made a list in my head of all the reasons this was a complicated idea. The list was long and mostly logical. Then I thought about the careful handwriting on thick paper, about coffee ordered exactly right, about the way Rhys Lawson listened like everything you said actually mattered. And then I texted him. "I think it could be something too, for what it's worth." His reply came after a few minutes, and it was only 4 words, but they were the right 4 words. "It's worth a lot." The following week, Carter invited me to another event, a smaller dinner, supposedly more intimate, which I suspected was Carter's way of re-establishing control over a narrative he sensed had shifted. I mentioned it to Rhys when we met for a walk along the waterfront one evening, the city lights reflecting in the dark water beside us. Rhys was quiet for a moment. We were walking close enough that our arms occasionally brushed, and neither of us moved away from it. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know," I said. "But I think I need to understand something about why I kept chasing him, about what I was actually looking for." I paused. "I don't think it was ever really Carter. I think I was looking for someone who would notice me, actually notice me, and I convinced myself he could be that person because he was available and visible and I didn't know any better." Rhys stopped walking. I stopped too, turning to look at him. The waterfront lights caught the planes of his face in gold and shadow, and his expression was open in a way I was beginning to recognize as rare and deliberate. Rhys didn't offer openness casually. And now? He asked. Now I know better, I said. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from my face. A small gesture, unhurried, and his fingers lingered at my temple for just a moment before dropping. If you go to Carter's dinner, he said quietly, I'll be there. I'm still contracted until the end of the month. I'll be there and I'll make sure nothing happens to you. You do that? I asked. Stand in the same room as someone you're beginning to resent, professionally, and watch over me anyway? Without question, Rhys said. And the simplicity of it, the complete absence of hesitation, did something permanent to my chest right then and there. Carter's dinner was at a private dining room in a restaurant so expensive it didn't display prices on the menu. 8 people, including me. I arrived in my nicest clothes, dark trousers, a deep green shirt that my coworker at the gallery had once said brought out my eyes, and immediately felt the familiar displacement of being technically present in a space while not quite belonging to it. But this time it was different. This time, as I took my seat near the end of the long table, I found Rhys positioned against the far wall in his professional capacity, and when my eyes found his, he gave me the smallest, most contained nod I'd ever seen. It said, I see you. You're okay. I was okay. Carter was charming through the appetizers, and the first course, the version of himself that had originally confused my perception of him. Attentive and funny and seemingly interested. He asked about my gallery work, made me feel briefly like the most important person at the table. I watched myself respond, watched myself start to soften toward it, and quietly registered what Rhys had helped me understand. This was Carter's skill, not Carter's substance. He could make anyone feel chosen for exactly as long as it served him. The shift happened over the main course. Carter was telling a story, one of his long, entertaining stories that required the full table's attention. And he was building toward a punchline, his voice rising with practiced timing. And then, at the peak of it, he gestured toward me and said, laughing, Eli here is the one who actually believed I sent that invitation because I liked him. Can you imagine? He said it to the table, not to me. He said it the way you'd say something about a charming misunderstanding, rather than a person sitting 4 feet away from you. His friends laughed. Someone said, that's brutal, man, in a tone that suggested they found it amusing, rather than concerning. The table continued. The story moved on. Carter poured more wine. I sat very still for approximately 10 seconds, during which I processed what had just happened with a clarity that felt almost surgical. He had used me, not cruelly in the dramatic sense. He hadn't set out to destroy me. I was simply a prop, a detail that made his stories more entertaining, an orbit he'd allowed me to enter because it gave him something to talk about at dinner parties. That was all I had ever been to Carter Voss. Not a person he wanted, a story he could tell. I looked up and found Rhys watching me from across the room. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes were asking a question. I gave him the answer with the smallest shake of my head. Not a dramatic scene, not here, not like this. He gave me another minimal nod. Understood, whenever you're ready. I excused myself to the restroom, and instead of returning to the dining room, I sent Rhys a single text. I'd like to leave. His reply came within 30 seconds. Side exit, turn left, out of the restroom, through the kitchen corridor. I'll meet you there. He was already there when I came through the door, jacket in hand, his professional face replaced by something more direct and unguarded. Are you all right? He asked immediately. I'm fine, I said, and I was not in the way that meant nothing had happened, but in the way that meant I understood exactly what had happened and had chosen how to feel about it. He used me as a punchline, in front of his friends at his table. I paused, and I'm not even that surprised, which tells me something. Rhys held the side door open for me, and we stepped out into a narrow street running beside the restaurant. Cool night air immediately replacing the warm, over-scented atmosphere of the dining room. What does it tell you? He asked. That I'm done, I said. That I went tonight because I needed to see it clearly one more time, and now I have. Carter is not someone I want anything from. I looked at Rhys. I think I went to that first party because I was lonely, and he seemed like the kind of person who could fix that, and I was completely wrong about that in every possible direction. Rhys was quiet for a moment. We were standing in the narrow street with the sounds of the city around us, and he was looking at me with that characteristic careful attention. Loneliness makes bad recommendations, he said. It tells you to go toward whatever is available rather than whatever is right. Yes, I said. Exactly that. He took a slow breath. Eli, I need to tell you something that isn't easy to say because I don't typically explain myself and I'm still not entirely sure how to do this. He met my eyes steadily. When I was growing up, my family had very little. My father worked multiple jobs and still couldn't keep us housed consistently. I took a criminology scholarship at 18 and was 2 years from finishing when my sister Maya was diagnosed with a serious heart condition. The treatment was expensive and ongoing. I left school, took the first high-paying position I could find, which was this. He indicated the jacket, the professional stance, the entire context. I work for Carter Voss because I am paid well enough to cover Maya's medical costs. That is the only reason. How old is she? I asked gently. 14, he said. She's doing better. The last round of treatment showed real improvement. Something crossed his face, a quiet pride so deep it was almost solemn. She's funny, sharp. She reads everything she can get her hands on. She'd like you, I think. She appreciates people who care about art. My chest ached in the best possible way. You gave up your education for her. She's my sister, Rhys said simply, as if there were nothing more to explain. We walked for a long time that night through the quieter streets around the restaurant, eventually finding a small late-night cafe where we sat with tea until almost midnight. He showed me a photo of Maya on his phone, a teenager with her brother's dark eyes and an expression of tremendous self-possession for someone her age. I told him about the moment I'd known I wanted to work with art, the specific museum afternoon I'd referenced in our early texts. He told me things slowly, carefully, the way he did everything. But he told me real things, the kind of things people don't usually say until much later. At some point, walking back toward the transit station, our hands found each other. Not dramatically, no charged moment or deliberate reach, just a gradual mutual arrival, fingers interlacing in the dark like it had always been the obvious configuration. Rhys looked down at our hands and then at me, and the expression on his face was so unguarded and so completely sincere that I had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much to absorb directly. I'm going to finish my contract with Carter, he said. 14 more days. I won't break a professional commitment, even to someone I've lost respect for. But after that, he stopped. After that? I pressed. After that, I'd like to figure out what comes next, he said. For me, professionally. And for this, he indicated the space between us, the held hands, the night. If you're willing to be patient for 14 days, I've been patient for 8 months in the wrong direction, I said. 14 days towards something real is nothing. Rhys smiled, a proper, complete smile, rare and unhurried, that changed his entire face. It was the first time I'd seen him smile like that, and it occurred to me that I wanted to be the reason for it as many times as possible. 14 days, he said. 14 days, I agreed. The 14 days were not peaceful. I hadn't expected them to be. Not with Carter involved, but the specific shape of the disruption was something I hadn't anticipated. It started on day 3. I was at the gallery cataloging a new shipment of prints, when my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. When I did, the voice on the other end was Carter's. Smooth and controlled, the performance version of himself. Eli. I've been thinking about dinner the other night. I may have been thoughtless. He paused, as if waiting for me to rush to fill the silence with reassurance. When I didn't, he continued, I'd like to make it up to you, properly this time. I sat with the phone against my ear and felt the ghost of the person I'd been 8 months ago. The version who would have felt his heart lift at exactly those words, who would have started rationalizing immediately, who would have found reasons why this time would be different. That person was not entirely gone, but he was no longer in charge. I appreciate you saying that, Carter, I said carefully. But I think we both know it wasn't thoughtlessness. It was just who you are in certain contexts. And that's okay. I'm not angry. I just don't think there's much to make up, because I don't think we were ever what I was imagining we were. A brief silence. Rhys, Carter said. Not a question. This is about Rhys. This is about me, I said. Rhys is a separate thing. He's my employee, Eli. Carter's voice had shifted. Less performance, more something underneath it. Something tighter. Whatever he's told you about himself, whatever impression he's given you, he's working within a context that you're not fully understanding. I think I understand it clearly. I said, Goodbye, Carter. I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet gallery, among the wrapped prints and the pale walls, breathing steadily. Then I texted Rhys. Carter called me. He knows. I handled it. Are you okay? The reply came quickly. Fine. He spoke to me this morning. I expected it. You didn't have to handle it alone. Then, after a pause, thank you for handling it alone. The situation escalated on day 7. Carter, apparently accustomed to compliance, didn't accept the closed door gracefully. He contacted my gallery. I found out later he'd told the owner that I'd caused a disturbance at a private event and he had concerns about my professional conduct. It was precisely calculated, vague enough to be difficult to disprove, specific enough to create doubt. My supervisor mentioned it to me carefully, diplomatically, and I stood in the back office and felt the particular cold fury of someone who has been attacked in a way designed to be hard to defend against. That evening I went to Rhys. His apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in a quiet part of the city. Modest, clean, with the same quality of deliberateness that characterized everything about him. He opened the door and immediately read my face. "Tell me," he said, stepping aside to let me in. I told him, all of it, the call to the gallery, what Carter had said, the conversation with my supervisor. Rhys listened without interrupting, standing in his kitchen with his arms crossed and his expression increasingly controlled in the way that meant he was managing something significant. "He went after your work," Rhys said when I finished. His voice was flat. "Yes," I said. Rhys was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and poured 2 glasses of water, practical, grounding, and brought them to the small table where I'd sat down. He sat across from me. "I have documentation," he said, "from my time working for Carter, records of events I witnessed, conversations I was present for, things that were said and done. I kept them because I've worked in security long enough to know that certain employers create situations where protection requires evidence." He looked at me directly. "Carter has done things that he would not want documented and disclosed. I have no interest in using that material vindictively, but if he continues to pursue you professionally, to use his connections to damage your livelihood, then the balance shifts." "That's not blackmail?" I asked carefully. "It's protection," Rhys said, "the same as anything else in my work. The goal isn't punishment. The goal is for him to understand that the cost of continuing to target you exceeds whatever satisfaction he gets from it." He paused. "But I won't do anything with it without telling you first. This affects you. You should have a voice in how it's handled." I looked at him across the small table. This man who had been managing his own impossible situation for years, quietly and without complaint, and who was now extending the same methodical care toward mine. "When did you decide I was worth this much effort?" I asked. Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, but the specific quality of honesty that occurred when Rhys Lawson decided to be completely transparent. "The lobby," he said, "when I set you down and you looked up at me and said why, instead of thank you. Like you genuinely needed to understand the reason behind it. Like motivation mattered to you more than the gesture." He paused. "Nobody asks why when someone does something kind. They just accept it and move on. You asked why. That told me something. I had no idea what to say to that. So instead I reached across the table and put my hand over his, and Rhys turned his palm up immediately, fingers closing around mine with that same quiet certainty he brought to everything. 7 more days, I said. 7 more days, he agreed, and then quieter. After which I'm done with Carter Voss, and I can figure out how to be something other than someone's employee. What do you want to be? I asked. I meant professionally. I also meant everything else. Rhys looked at me steadily. Present, he said. Fully present, without obligations that compromise what actually matters. His thumb moved across my knuckles, slow and deliberate. With you if you'll still have me by then. I'll still have you, I said. Outside the city hummed and glittered, entirely indifferent to the two of us sitting in a quiet kitchen deciding that something complicated was absolutely worth it. Day 14 arrived quietly, without ceremony. Rhys texted at 7 in the morning. Last day, I'll return the equipment this afternoon. It's done by 4 o'clock, and then after a brief pause, I'd like to see you tonight, if that's okay. I replied yes before I'd fully finished reading the message. I spent the day at the gallery in a state of productive distraction, helping hang a new exhibition of mixed media works by a local artist whose pieces involved layers of translucent material that changed appearance depending on the angle of light. It was absorbing work, the kind that required physical precision and visual attention simultaneously, and it kept me from watching my phone too compulsively. My coworker, a perceptive woman named Joanna, who had noticed the general shift in my demeanor over the past 2 weeks without pressing me for details, glanced at me around mid-afternoon and said, "Whatever is happening with you lately, it seems like it's working." "I think it is," I said, which was perhaps the most honest assessment I'd managed in months. Rhys arrived at my apartment at 7. He was still wearing the dark clothes he'd worn to return Carter's equipment, but the jacket was gone, and without it he looked like himself in a way that the professional uniform had always slightly obscured. He handed me a folded paper bag when I opened the door from the good bakery 3 blocks from his apartment that I'd mentioned once in passing and hadn't expected him to remember. "You remembered," I said. "I remember everything you tell me," he said simply. Not as a romantic declaration but as a statement of fact, which somehow made it more significant. We ate at my small kitchen table, and Rhys talked more than I'd heard him talk consecutively before. He'd spoken with a contact from his criminology program that afternoon, someone now working in corporate risk management, who'd mentioned that a position might be opening in the firm's personal security division. Different from what he'd been doing. More structured, more professional, better aligned with the training he'd started before leaving school. "I have an appointment with them next week," he said. "It's not certain, but it's a direction." "Rhys, that's exactly what you need," I said. And I meant it with a completeness that surprised even me, that I could feel so genuinely invested in his future. His stability, his ability to build something of his own. "Maya's next assessment is in 3 weeks, he continued. "The cardiologist thinks the trajectory is positive. She may be able to reduce one of her medications if the results are what he's expecting." He said it with the quiet, careful hopefulness of someone who had learned not to celebrate prematurely. "She's been asking about you." I looked up sharply. "She knows about me?" "She knows I've been seeing someone," Rhys said, a slight correction to whatever I'd implied. "She's 14 and perceptive, and she noticed I was different." I didn't confirm details, but I didn't deny it either. He met my eyes. "Is that all right?" "More than all right," I said. "I'd like to meet her, when the time feels right." "She'd take that entirely in stride and then immediately judge you based on your taste in books," Rhys said, and the affection in his voice when he talked about his sister was so complete and so unguarded that it made my chest ache. After dinner, we moved to the small couch in my living room, and I showed Rhys the documentation for the exhibition at the gallery. The translucent layers, the way the pieces responded to light from different angles, the artist's notes about transparency and perception. He looked at everything carefully and asked specific questions, not performative interest but genuine attention. At some point the reading light fell across his face, and I saw him clearly, really clearly, in a way that felt like the visual equivalent of the floor dropping. "Carter called me this morning," Rhys said suddenly. He was looking at the exhibition notes in his hands, not at me, and his voice was matter of fact. "To confirm the arrangement was ended." He also said, he paused briefly, he said I was making a mistake. His exact words were that I was throwing away a stable position for someone who would get bored of the novelty and leave. I was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Rhys said. I hung up. He looked at me then. "I don't require his opinion on my decisions. But I thought you should know," he said it. "He's wrong," I said clearly. "What I feel isn't novelty. Novelty wears off in a few days. This has been building since a parking lot at midnight with a first aid kit." I held his gaze. "That's not novelty. That's recognition." Rhys reached over and took the gallery notes from my hands, setting them aside on the table. Then he turned to face me fully, and his expression was so open and so deliberate that it made my breath unsteady. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it clearly because I think you deserve things said clearly rather than implied or circled around." "Okay," I said. "I love you," Rhys said, simply, directly, without preamble or performance. I am not certain of the exact moment it became that specific, but I know it's been true for longer than I've been ready to name it. You are the most genuine person I have encountered in years, and you make me want to be present in my own life rather than just functional in it. I wanted you to know that plainly. The room was very quiet. I could hear traffic outside, distant and constant, and the refrigerator's low hum from the kitchen. "Rhys," I said, and then I stopped because what I wanted to say was large and I wanted to get it right. "You taught me what it feels like to be actually seen by someone. Not noticed, not found entertaining, not useful. Seen. And I've fallen in love with you in the way that feels like something I can build a life around, not just a feeling to have in the moment." I paused. "So yes, completely yes." He kissed me then, unhurried and completely sure. The way he did everything, and in my small apartment with the city outside and the exhibition notes on the table and everything uncertain except this one specific thing, it felt like arriving somewhere I hadn't known I was traveling toward. The morning after Rhys told me he loved me, I woke up early and lay in the quiet thinking about the specific shape of the last several months, the trajectory from a penthouse floor to here to this to someone asleep in the next room who had chosen me with intention and said so plainly. The path had been humiliating in places and painful in others and occasionally genuinely frightening. but the destination was worth every step of it, and I was aware enough to know that clearly, Rhys was already up when I got to the kitchen, which didn't surprise me. He was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 6. He'd made coffee and found the bread in my cabinet and made toast, and he was standing at my kitchen window looking at the city in the early light with an expression of something uncomplicated and quiet. Peaceful, maybe. "Morning," he said when he heard me. "Morning," I said. I poured coffee and stood beside him at the window, and we looked at the city together for a while, without needing to say anything, which was one of the things about Rhys I had come to love. The way silence between us was never uncomfortable but always full of something. The week that followed was the beginning of a new kind of normal. Rhys attended the interview with the corporate security firm, and was offered a probationary position which he accepted. It was a significant step down in income from Carter's contract, at least initially, but it was genuinely his, without the complications and compromises that had characterized the previous arrangement. He called me after the interview with a restrained version of relief in his voice that sounded, to someone who knew him, like considerable excitement. "This is the right direction," he said. "It absolutely is," I agreed. "And it's only the start." I met Maya on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after day 14. Rhys drove us to the hospital for her follow-up appointment. The assessment his cardiologist had been anticipating, and I waited in the corridor while the appointment happened, and then Rhys came to find me with his face composed and his eyes bright. "The medication reduction is confirmed," he said. "She's improving significantly." And then, because he was Rhys and not given to excessive display, he simply stood with his forehead bowed briefly toward mine in a moment of shared relief before pulling himself together. Maya was in the room when we went back in, sitting up in the hospital bed with a book face down on her lap, and an expression of comprehensive assessment trained on me the moment I walked through the door. She had Rhys's dark eyes and a watchfulness that was entirely her own. "So you're the one," she said immediately. "Apparently," I said. "He smiles more," she said, indicating her brother with a nod. "He thinks I don't notice. I notice everything." She considered me for another moment. "What kind of art?" "Mixed media, mostly. Installation work, some painting, Hopper or Rothko. Both depending on the mood." She nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay," she said, "you can stay." And she picked up her book again as if the entire matter were settled, which, as far as Maya was concerned, it apparently was. On the drive home, Rhys was quiet in a different way than usual. Not withdrawn, but processing something. At a red light, he said, without looking away from the road, "She's never done that before. Decided so quickly." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" He glanced at me briefly. "It means she trusts her own judgment." Which means she saw something worth trusting. 2 months after that, Carter Voss quietly stopped being a presence in either of our lives. The specific mechanism was unspectacular. Carter's father's company faced a regulatory audit unrelated to anything we'd done, and Carter himself became sufficiently occupied with family business concerns that whatever residual interest he'd maintained in our situation simply evaporated. People like Carter, I came to understand, didn't maintain long-term focus on things that stopped providing immediate entertainment. We had ceased to be entertaining to him, and so we ceased to exist in his attention. Rhys and I went to the gallery opening together on a Friday evening in the fall. The full exhibition of translucent layered works that I'd been helping prepare since the summer. He wore a dark jacket and stood beside me for most of the evening, quietly attentive, occasionally saying precise and insightful things about specific pieces that made me remember he'd been studying perceptual theory before life redirected him. Several people assumed he was an artist rather than a security consultant, and he accepted the confusion without correcting it. Afterward, we walked home through the cooler evening air. The city was at that specific autumn temperature that made the lights look sharper, and the streets were busy with Friday evening people moving through their own unconnected lives. Rhys had my hand in his, unhurried fingers interlaced. "I want to go back to school," he said, the way he said important things without prologue, simply placing the statement in front of me. "Not immediately, and not full-time. But the criminology program has an evening and weekend track for working professionals." I looked into it. He glanced at me. "I want to finish what I started." "Yes," I said immediately, before he'd even finished. "Absolutely yes. Rhys, I'm not asking permission," he said gently. "I'm telling you because it affects our time together and I believe in transparency." A pause. "I'm also telling you because you're the reason I started believing in finishing things again." I stopped walking. He stopped too, turning to face me on the evening pavement with the city moving around us. "You said something to me once," I told him, when I was trying to articulate why I'd kept going back to Carter. You said loneliness makes bad recommendations. I held his gaze. For almost a year, my loneliness was recommending Carter Voss. And then you carried me out of a penthouse in front of 40 people without being asked. And my loneliness got better information. Rhys's expression did the thing it did when he was allowing himself to feel something completely better information. He repeated, "The best," I said. "You." He pulled me in then, right there on the evening street, and held me with the same steadiness he brought to everything, the kind that wasn't about force or possession but about certainty, about being exactly where he meant to be, doing exactly what he'd chosen to do. And I held him back with everything I had, because Rhys Lawson had walked into a room full of people laughing at me and decided without hesitation that I was worth carrying. Not because I was impressive or useful or entertaining, simply because I deserved better than the floor. That, it turned out, was enough. It was everything.